Welcome to the Alliance for Water Efficiency's webinar on the AWE Water Conservation Tracking Tool. This webinar originally aired on July 28, 2016. Unfortunately, we lost the audio of the recording, but we're going to go through the slides again. We started out with the usual welcome to the webinar and reminded everyone that they were on mute, etc. But we did have a great question and answer period after the presentation, and I'll be going through those questions again and answering each one of them. On the webinar, we had Mary Ann Dickinson, President and CEO of the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and myself, Bill Christensen, Program Manager at the Alliance for Water Efficiency. Today, for this re-recording, it will just be me, Bill Christensen, going through the slides. The goals of the webinar were to provide an overview of the AWE Water Conservation Tracking Tool and introduce it to those of you who aren't familiar with it. But we also wanted to discuss the details of version 3 and the associated updates for people who have used the tracking tool. And then, as I mentioned, we wanted to answer any questions attendees may have had about the tracking tool and any changes that were made to it. So to get started, what is the AWE Water Conservation Tracking Tool? It's an Excel-based model that can be used to evaluate the costs and benefits of water conservation programs. It does require macros to run, and I included that there because that's probably the #1 problem we see users encounter is the macro settings on their machine. So just a reminder, when you download the tool and gain access to it, make sure your Excel program is set up to run macros. It also comes with a great user guide. It's very detailed and will walk you through each section of the tracking tool and answer pretty much any question you'll have about it. Of course, we're always here to answer any questions that you can't find an answer to in the user guide. It contains a lot of graphics, so a lot of the outputs are displayed in various charts that are usable for presentations you might be given to a manager or a board. So that's a very nice feature of it. It can be copy and pasted right into a PowerPoint. And the tracking tool is a free resource for AWE members. It's something we're very proud to offer to our AWE members who support us. Again, to get started, I kind of wanted to take a high-level view of the tracking tool and what goes into it and what we get out of it. So up in this funnel graphic, we have 3 primary things that go into the tracking tool. We enter demographic data about our service area, and then we enter a baseline water demand forecast. Then we enter system avoided cost data, and we define the conservation activities that we want to evaluate. So what is the program A? What types of water savings would we expect? And what are the costs associated with those programs? And then the tracking tool gives us some very nice outputs in terms of the water savings we can expect from a single program and a portfolio of programs. We get a benefit cost analysis for each water conservation program we evaluate. And we also get a benefit cost analysis of a whole suite of water conservation programs. Next, we get some insight into how those water conservations and the associated demand reductions will impact revenue and rates. And then last but not least, we get energy savings associated with water conservation. So what are some of the special features of the tracking tool? Well, it comes with a predefined library of conservation measures. So we did a lot of research and digging into common costs and savings for a variety of water conservation programs. And that built-in library can be customized. So you can import an activity from the library and you can make changes to the assumptions. It also allows you to build any water conservation program you can think of from scratch, provided you have cost and savings information. The tracking tool also estimates passive savings related to the plumbing code. So savings that'll occur naturally over time through the replacement of inefficient fixtures. It, as I mentioned, estimates conservation's impact on a utility's revenue requirement and how that might impact rates, and estimates energy reductions due to conservation. In addition to that, it goes a step further and estimates greenhouse gas emission reductions related to water conservation. And of course, there are a lot more features, too many to list on one slide, certainly. So we released the tracking tool in 2009. It's hard to believe that was that long ago. But we put out version 1.0 in 2009, and it's been through a series of updates. So we moved on to 1.1, 1.2, and then a major update to 2.0. And now we're very excited to release version 3.0. Over the years, we've had almost 400 registered users. So a lot of our members have gained access to the tool and found it to be a very helpful resource in planning. And at the bottom of this slide are 4 screenshots of the various tracking tools from 2009 on. So these are the navigation worksheets for the past tracking tools. And so we updated it, and it has a very new look, which I'm going to switch to the next slide, and you'll see the navigation screen for 3.0. So it looks a lot different, and it's not just the looks that were updated. So we'll go through that, but this is the navigation screen for version 3.0. So what updates did we make besides the new navigation screen? In addition to the new look, we also updated the graphics within the tracking tool. So there are additional charts, and the charts that were already existing in the tracking tool have been updated and modernized, if you will. The worksheets themselves have been reorganized to give a better user experience and have more efficient data input, as well as laying the outputs out in a more efficient way. We had a major update of the clothes washer and dishwasher passive savings models to reflect the changes on the federal level for requirements for those appliances. We also shortened the planning period to 35 years. And in previous versions of the tracking tool, there were some hidden worksheets. They were always accessible, but we hid them, and the user had to right-click and unhide them, for example. So all of those worksheets have been revealed and have been brought to the forefront. And there were a lot more changes. We have a complete list on the AWE website, and I'll show you where that is after the presentation. So moving forward, I'm going to take you through each of the worksheets of the tracking tool and familiarize you with each worksheet. So here we are on the Common Assumptions worksheet. And here is where we enter demographic data and other characteristics associated with our service area. The first thing the user would do is click on this button to set up the customer classes for the service area. So we'd click that button and define each of the customer classes. In this example, we have 4. We have single family, multifamily, CII, and irrigation. And then once that's entered, we select which state our service area is located in. And this is related to the passive savings. So the users can select California, Colorado, Georgia, Texas, or other if they're not located in any of those states. This is a new feature for version 3.0. In previous versions, we had separate editions for each of those states. And we found it would be easier to manage for AWE and our users if we rolled those up into one file. We also added Colorado as they passed new legislation between the release of version 2.0 and now 3.0. So Colorado is now included. The user, after selecting the state, selects the volume units, and the user has the option between million gallons, acre feet, or megaliters. And the metric unit of measure is another update for version 3.0. It was previously million cubic meters. We got some feedback that users would prefer megaliters, so that was changed. Next, the user would enter the start year for the forecast, and then move down and enter a population forecast as well as a forecast for single-family and multifamily housing units. And then another forecast that is entered is the number of accounts for each of our customer classes that we defined. I zoomed out a little bit on the Common Assumptions worksheet, and if we click this Manage Scenarios button, it will allow us to save a new scenario and manage it. So we can save it, update it after we've made some updates, which will essentially save that scenario. And then if we get a bunch of scenarios saved and we want to delete some, we have that option too with the Delete Scenario button. So in this example, I clicked the button Save New Scenario, and this dialog box popped up, and then you can enter a name for your new scenario. In this case, it's webinar example. We would click OK, and it would be added to this list. And here's a great time to point out the fact that the tracking tool comes with demonstration data built into it. So you could load up an example for metric units or an example for English units and see the tracking tool populated with data. Whenever you're getting familiar with a new model, it's nice to have some data already in it to see how it functions. Empty models can be very difficult to learn. So we provide that, and I think that's a very, very useful feature. Once we enter all of our population, housing unit, and account forecasts, we move down and enter some financial assumptions. First, we select the dollar base year, or the year in which the costs will be denominated. We enter our annual inflation rate and our nominal interest rate. Next, we enter utility rates for each of our customer class customers. So what our customers pay for water, sewer if there's a volumetric charge, and same for electricity and gas. And after we do that, we enter the annual rate of increase for those rates on the customer side. And I'll talk about why we do that later on in the presentation. Following the financial assumptions and the rate information, we enter some demographic data related to persons per household, full and half baths per dwelling unit. And if you don't have that information, there is a lookup table. You can click this button and it'll bring that information up. It may not have your precise location, but it has most major cities and locations around the country. Next, the user enters dwelling units in 1994, which is used to estimate the stock of inefficient fixtures. And same for the population value in 1990. That is used to estimate inefficient fixtures on the commercial side. And once those data are entered, we enter information that's used for landscape measures in the Library of Conservation Activities. And here the user can use the model's landscape water use calculator or select the radio button I'm hovering over now and use your own landscape water use estimates. Once we work through the Common Assumptions worksheet, we're ready to enter our baseline demands. And we have two options here. We can enter an existing demand forecast that we already have, but if we don't have that, we can use the tracking tool for a simple demand forecast and grow it by population or account growth. We can also select to have our demand affected by the plumbing code, or adjusted rather. So if you enter a demand forecast and it already accounts for the plumbing code effect, you can select to not have the tracking tool do that. But if your demand forecast has not taken that into account, you can have the tracking tool do that. And again, we have separate estimates for California, Colorado, Georgia, Texas, and then the rest of the states. So here's our specified demands worksheet where we enter our demand forecast. The first thing we encounter here is entering our peak season dates. So when does the peak season begin and when does it end? Next, we move down, and if we want to enter our own demand forecast, that's the first option. We could select the radio button that I'm hovering over now and just paste in our demand forecast. Or we can select to extrapolate it using the population forecast we entered or based on our account forecast. We also enter the peak season percent of that annual demand. Last, we enter system loss, and then we move down the worksheet and select whether or not our demand forecast that we've entered accounts for the effects of the plumbing code. New for version 3, the adjustment for the plumbing code has been brought forward. So this was always there and always available for the user to see, but we brought it forward so you can see that adjustment. This worksheet also has some graphs that the user can look and see the demand before the plumbing code adjustment is made and after it's made. Following the entry of the demand forecast, we enter information related to our avoided costs. This is a very important piece of using the tracking tool, and it's good to take time here to get the avoided costs correct. This is where we see what the value of saved water essentially is. So we have two options here. We can enter an existing avoided cost forecast, or the tracking tool has an avoided cost calculator. So you're starting to see a theme here, which is we offer flexibility to enter existing forecasts, but if you don't have that on hand, you can use the built-in calculator of the tracking tool. So the model's built-in avoided cost calculator looks at short-run avoided costs related to water supply, and if you provide wastewater service, you can also enter avoided costs related to that, and then long-run avoided costs related to deferred capacity expansion. So this screenshot shows what the avoided cost worksheet would look like if we select the radio button to use our own estimates that we've created. If we select the radio button to use the avoided cost calculator built into the tracking tool, the user will see this worksheet. And here we follow the directions given essentially. And I don't think I mentioned it yet, but new for the appearance of the tracking tool for version 3 is that yellow cells are where the user enters data. Blue cells are where the user does not have to enter data and should not modify because it could throw off some formulas. So in the yellow cells, we enter information such as the cost of water purchase on a volumetric rate. So this is, in this example, dollars per acre feet. This would be different depending on the volume units you select on the Common Assumptions worksheet. Of course, not everyone purchases water, but we can build other costs in here, such as energy use, chemicals, and any other costs that vary based on production. And again, if we have wastewater service, we can also enter avoided costs related to that. After we enter the costs, we enter the nominal increase per year for those costs. Going down below, we enter more of the long run costs, or costs that could be avoided if we don't have to expand our capacity, or even if we can defer it or downsize it. So we enter our existing peak season delivery capacity, and then we enter the increment of capacity that would be added. The model estimates the year a shortfall would occur. And here, for the capacity that will be added, we can use the model's estimate, or we can enter our own value. And once that's entered, we estimate the cost of new capacity on a per MGD basis. If there are any costs that weren't captured in the above, we can enter them here in these yellow cells in rows 62 and 63. So there's that section for other avoided costs that were not captured above. Once the avoided costs are entered, we're now ready to set up our conservation measures. We have two options here. We can build a water conservation measure from scratch, or we can import from the library of measures that have already been predefined. However, you do have the flexibility to modify predefined measures and customize them for your location. So the library currently has 30 measures. 16 of those are residential, 10 are CII measures, and 4 of them are large landscape. And here's what that worksheet looks like. When you click over to the Define Activities worksheet, the table by default is hidden. So you'll see a button that will allow you to unhide that. And then to set up a measure, you click the Define, Edit, Delete Conservation Activities button. And you'll see a dialog box like the one I'm hovering the cursor over now. In this example, we've got the activity Residential High Efficiency Toilets, which we've named and imported from the library, and then we select the affected customer class. So in this case, it's our single family customer class that we're going to target with this program. Then we set a variety of parameters for the conservation activity, such as water savings, utility costs, any cost the participant will experience, and participant non-water benefits. So that could even mean savings on the sewer side and any energy savings that would result from the customer participating in a program. And then if there's a related plumbing code, we can enter some information about that as well. So in this case, for a high efficiency toilet program, there is a plumbing code related to it, and so we would enter some information there. So I'll walk you through this unit water savings tab, and we see we've got our expected water savings. In this example, it's gallons per year. If it was metric, that would be a metric value. If there's any savings decay, that can be entered as well. This might be something you would enter for a survey program or a program where you're changing behavior and you expect that behavior to revert back to what it was. So you could enter decay rate over time. What % of that savings will occur during the peak season? And then if there's a useful life associated with a fixture replacement or appliance replacement, you could enter that here. In this example, it's set to 0. And if you set the useful life to 0, it's assumed that the savings from that intervention, or that, in this case, a toilet replacement, that those savings will persist indefinitely. And the reason it's set to 0 for toilets is because there is a plumbing code, and it's assumed that once an inefficient toilet is changed out, in the future, if it is replaced, it'll be replaced by another efficient toilet with equal or greater efficiency. And then if you anticipate having free riders in your program, you could estimate what % of the population of participants will be free riders. Free riders are participants in your program that would have taken that action anyway, even without an incentive. New for version 3 is the ability to select the utility as the affected customer class. This was added so a utility leak detection program can be specified. So that's a new feature of version 3.0. And the user guide contains guidance on using the Water Research Foundation's component analysis model to develop specifications so you can design and parameterize a conservation activity within the tracking tool. Once you've defined your water conservation programs and set the costs and the savings that are expected from those programs, you enter your annual activity levels. So if we hover over this high efficiency toilet program in row 3 with the cursor over it, we see the value of 1,000 in 2015. So this water utility was expecting that they would rebate 1,000 toilets in 2015. But then the activity kind of peters out and they only plan 100 moving forward. So this is just where you say, this is how many rebates we plan to provide, or fixture changeouts, whatever your program may be, residential surveys, this is the activity level. And new for version 3.0, annual program overhead cost is now entered in the annual activity level worksheet. This used to live on the utility costs and benefits worksheet, but is now here. And it makes sense to have it on the data input worksheets rather than on the output worksheets. But here's where you can add any overhead that might affect a whole suite of measures or any costs that weren't captured when you were defining individual activities. Once the activity levels are entered, the user has the option to enter data for the greenhouse gas module. These calculations are used to estimate the energy intensity of your water and for wastewater if you choose. The first thing the user does is selects which eGrid region they're located. This will populate the model with some default eGrid factors, so the pounds of various greenhouse gas per megawatt hour. The user also has the option to enter their own emission factors should they have those on hand. So there's a map over here where the user can see what eGrid region they're located in. We updated the eGrid emission factors to the 2012 database, which was released in 2015, and at the time of this webinar is the most recent data set. Moving on, the user can enter their own energy intensity estimates for their water supply, or the user can use the built-in calculator. Again, that's kind of the theme of the tracking tool, is you're provided the flexibility to use your own estimates, or the model has a built-in calculator. And I kind of skipped ahead. The user also enters the average rate paid per kilowatt hour for electricity. So if we use the model's energy intensity calculator, we fill out a series of cells related to our water supply and treatment. And then if we scroll down, there would be similar things for the wastewater side. And then it generates an average energy intensity of water supply. In this case, it's expressed as kilowatt hours per acre foot. Now we're ready to move on to the output worksheets. And the first one the user encounters is the activity savings profiles. So here we're looking at individual water conservation programs and the expected savings from those efforts. Here we're looking at a chart for the residential high efficiency toilet program. And the chart shows us the savings. And as we mentioned earlier, there is a plumbing code related to this, and that's shown in red on the chart. So over time, it is likely that our population of toilets that were rebated or incentivized in whatever fashion, it's likely that some of those toilets would have been replaced anyway due to the plumbing code. So those toilets would have been naturally replaced. Therefore, if we make that selection, and that is the default selection in the library, some of the savings from that population of incentivized toilets will be credited to the plumbing code. And in the blue, those are credited to the utility program itself. Below in the table, we see lifetime water savings and average annual water savings. And that is broken out into savings that are credited to the National Plumbing Code, or it could be the state level if a state is selected, and then what is credited to the utility. Then a combination of those savings is also presented in this table. So this chart is an example of a graphic that can be copy and pasted into a PowerPoint presentation or a report very easily. Next up is the water saving summary worksheet. And this is more of a high-level view of the savings, where the worksheet before we can look at individual activities. Here we can look at our service area demand, which is being shown now in this chart. And we have our baseline demand forecast on top, our demand forecast that has been adjusted for the plumbing code. And then the last line shows additional savings, or it shows rather the forecast with our plumbing code adjustment and then the adjustment from our water conservation programs. So there are a variety of charts that can be viewed here. Service area demand, per capita demand and how that's affected, annual water savings, program savings by customer class, and then combined savings by customer class. And all of the information displayed in the charts is available in tables if you scroll below on this worksheet. Next up is the utility revenue and rates worksheet, where we can look at the impact of our conservation programs on our revenue requirement and how we would have to change our water rate to account for that. So this just looks at the impact of the conservation programs. And you can choose a variety of charts again, revenue requirement, average water rate, average water bill, and then the changes in those things as well. The charts have some nice flexibility and features in that you can also look at this effect if you were to debt finance your water conservation programs. And in the chart, you can choose your debt financing terms. In this case is 15 years. And you can also select how many years to display in the chart. If you need some information on how to interpret these charts, you can click on the chart explanation button, which is a very nice feature. The chart that's currently being shown shows the change in annual volumetric revenue requirement based on the impact of the utility conservation programs. So with these red bars, we're seeing what that impact would be if we paid as we go for our programs, or paid with cash up front as we implement our programs. So we can see our revenue requirement would change and go up as we're funding those programs. If we debt finance it, we can smooth out that increase or change in revenue requirement. And again, we can adjust the debt financing terms and see how that might change. So it's a pretty cool thing and gives a lot of insight into the financial impact of water conservation programs. Next up is one of my favorite worksheets. It's kind of where the rubber meets the road, and we get to see if the conservation programs as we have them set up are going to be cost-effective measures and how they pencil out. So this worksheet starts out with conservation program cost analysis. It shows the unit cost per acre foot of savings, the cumulative water savings for each program, the present value cost for each program, and the annual program implementation cost. Below that is a table that is the same thing but on the benefit side. So we see the unit benefit, again, the cumulative water savings that are the same as in the cost table, the present value benefit of each program, and then any benefit related to capacity expansion, deferral, downsizing, or avoidance. If we scroll below on that worksheet, we see the table that gives us our benefit cost ratio and the net present value of each program. So what are the costs and the benefits in comparison? And if we were to divide the benefits by the costs, will we have a number greater than 1? We like to see a number of 1 or greater at minimum, which says that the benefits outweigh the costs. If a program is expected to not be cost effective, it will be less than 1 and automatically highlighted red. And here I want to point out that these are arbitrary examples, and none of these programs that are showing up as not cost effective, that doesn't mean they won't be cost effective in your service area. We all have different situations with our avoided costs and how we're going to specify our programs in terms of costs and expected savings. So these are just examples and not intended to say whether or not a program is or is not cost effective. So we get a net present value and a benefit cost ratio for each program individually. And then we also get one including any overhead costs that we entered back on the activity level worksheet. So that's a pretty cool feature where we can see, if we have overhead that kind of are related to all the programs being run, how that plays into it as well. And then below that table, there's a few charts we can look at. Here we've got the unit cost for each program, and that's sorted. So it'll be in a different order, most likely, than this table. And then net present value sorted and benefit cost ratio sorted are also available. Next is a worksheet that compares your water conservation programs to water loss control benchmarks. So the cost of water control based on some studies. Here you can look at your water conservation measures and get some insight in terms of, should we pursue a water loss control program instead? Next up, we don't just look at the costs and benefits on the utility side, we also look at the customer. So any customers that participate in a program are going to experience potentially some costs and also some benefits. So let's say we rebate a toilet, but we don't rebate the full cost of it. We assume the customer then will experience some cost to make that change in their household. So they can get benefits in terms of their utility bills, and in the tracking tool we look at the water bill, sewer bill, electric, and gas. So going all the way back to our common assumptions worksheet, when we entered the customer rates, this is part of where they come into play. So we'll look at that worksheet, which is set up very much like the utility costs and benefits worksheet. We see our customer program costs, so the cost to the customer to participate in the program. We also see our water bill savings for the customer, and then if we scroll down, we'd see that for all of the other utilities as well, such as sewer, electric, and gas. Scrolling to the bottom of the page, we're again presented with our benefit cost ratio and net present value for each program, and then a total. You might notice that for some of these programs, the benefit cost ratio says not applicable. That's because in these instances, there is no cost for the customer to participate. So a benefit-cost ratio just doesn't make sense. Programs where there is a cost to the customer, they can see what their benefit-cost ratio would be. This information can be very helpful to communicate to your customers the benefits of participating in your programs. And again, the same charts that were available on the utility side are available on the customer side. Here we're displaying the net present value sorted. The last output worksheet is the greenhouse gas reduction benefits worksheet. Users of the tracking tool might notice that this has been updated. There are 4 charts here: annual electricity savings, annual gas savings, annual CO2 equivalent emission reductions, and then the same on a cumulative basis, so cumulative CO2 equivalent emission reductions. We changed the charts to display a carbon dioxide equivalent because due to issues of scale, the other greenhouse gases didn't show up on the chart, so it was converted into a CO2 equivalent for version 3.0. All of the data that are being displayed in the chart can be viewed below in table form. So that's a nice feature. Anything in a chart, anywhere in the tracking tool, those tables are easily accessible, and you typically just have to scroll down on the page to find it. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that there are some background calculation sheets. They used to be hidden. They were always available, but now they've been brought to the forefront. And this is a shot of our navigation screen, which we looked at way back at the beginning of the presentation. And if you scroll down on that navigation screen, you'll see a list of all the background data sheets and calculation sheets. They're also available if you scroll to the right, just on the Excel worksheet tabs. You will see all of them as well. So what is the availability of the tracking tool? It is available free of charge to AWE members, as I mentioned earlier. Part of that is we provide all future updates. You'll get a notice if we make any changes. For example, we just rolled out 3.0. On the chance we find a bug or we make a small change, you'll automatically receive notice about that. And then when we make major updates, we email all the users and let them know about that. We also provide 1 free hour of technical assistance to our members along with the tracking tool. And then if users want additional assistance in using the tracking tool, we're happy to provide that as well. So how do you get version 3.0? Well, you have to be a member, but then you have to visit our water conservation tracking tool page and fill out the terms of use. We updated the terms of use in addition to updating the tracking tool, so we're asking all existing members to fill out the new terms of use. And then we'll email you a link so you can download the tracking tool and the user guide. And I'll go out to our webpage and show you how you can fill out the terms of use and submit it. So this was the point in the webinar where we asked people to type in their questions and we would answer them. We had a number of questions. In fact, our question and answer period was longer than the presentation itself and went for almost an hour. So we had a lot of great questions, which I'll get to. This is also where we mentioned that our next webinar is going to be on September 1st, and it will be part of the Exemplary Program Series, and it will focus on school and youth conservation programs. So that's really cool. We highly recommend you check that out. And I do believe now there's some information on our website. So at this point, I'm going to go through the webinar questions we received and answer them. It's too bad we have to re-record this because Mary Ann provided a lot of great answers to people's questions, but We'll go through them, and I'll do my best in her absence. So the first question we had was, are there literature citations for the sources used to determine impacts? So the costs and savings of conservation programs. And the answer to that is yes, there are citations and descriptions for each water conservation activity, and that is all in the user guide. So all of the assumptions for savings and costs came from a literature review and a lot of research. So the user guide is a great resource related to cost and savings estimates. And then someone asked, has anyone used the tracking tool to evaluate historic or past conservation efforts? And yes, users have done that. And the tracking tool was kind of named because you can track your past activity if you want. So it can definitely be used to enter past water conservation activity. And you could even save a scenario that would do just that and be a historical look at your conservation programs. Next, someone asked, as a utility member, are multiple users allowed to access the tracking tool? Yes, a member can have multiple users, but we do encourage that each user of the tracking tool fills out the terms of use. And the reason I recommend that is so each user will get a notification if we make an update to the tracking tool. So if you become part of that registered user list, you'll get all future notifications. Next up, can consultants who are AWE members use the tracking tool to develop water conservation plans for a utility that is not an AWE member? And the answer to that question is no. Both parties in that case would have to be AWE members. And that is detailed in the terms of use, which we'll go out to the website in a little bit, and I'll walk you through that. Next, can data entered from previous versions of the tracking tool be exported into the new tool? So for version 3, we made so many updates that we don't have an export routine from a previous version, such as version 2.0. However, all of the data from version 2 can be copied and pasted into the model. So that shouldn't take too long. And in many cases, I think it would be preferable to copy and paste versus using an import routine. But if you're doing that, if you're moving from version 2 to version 3.0 and you're having difficulty, please give the office a call and we will walk you through that. Next, we have a question that asks, can the tool be used to help determine conservation potential at scales, such as regional or state, so other than the individual utility? That's an interesting question. The tracking tool was designed to evaluate water conservation at the utility scale. However, we have seen users, for example, for a wholesale service area roll up results from individual utilities. So it's not impossible to have the scale go beyond a single utility, but we'd have to be careful in how we did that. So if you're interested in doing something like that or have questions about the tracking tool capability, I would recommend shooting us an email or giving us a call, and we can talk through what it is you're looking to do and whether or not it would be appropriate to use the tracking tool. Next, we have a question that asks, can you copy and paste into the Activity Library tab for populating version 3 from previous versions? So they're asking about our Define Activities tab, and we looked at the dialog box where you design the water conservation activities, but there's also a table behind that. And so this user is asking, if they can copy and paste from previous versions. And yes, you can do that. However, notice on that table there's a warning signal on it that says do not delete anything from that table, specifically the rows. So you'll see that when you open up the tracking tool. But yes, you can paste in from version 2. Next, one of the attendees wants to know if we can provide a list of the 30 measures that are part of the built-in activity library. And the answer to that is yes. We've posted a document on the AWE tracking tool webpage, which we will go visit here shortly. And then our participation rates entered for each measure is our next question. Yes, that is on the interactivities worksheet, which we looked at. So you would enter, again, I'm going to go back to the example of toilet rebates, but whatever your program is, you enter for each year what your expected activity level is. And then someone wants to know what the cost would be to access the tracking tool for a non-member. The cost would be the same as a membership. However, we could make that into an agreement to use the tracking tool, kind of like a software license, if you will. But the cost would be the same as an AWE membership. However, we know memberships can be a tricky thing to find funding for at times. So we can work with you on that if need be. Next, we were asked if there are any parts of the tracking tool that would be less functional for Canadian users. And I would say not really, other than perhaps the assumptions related to passive savings. But overall, it's very usable in Canada. In fact, I've worked with a few utilities in Canada who have used the tracking tool. Next up, we have, does this Excel form export to a database? There is not an export function. However, you can very easily copy data from the tracking tool and paste it in to another program. It's not locked, and you can copy and paste, but there's not an export routine built into it. Next, we have a question that asks, does this version take into consideration the Water Research Foundation's reuse 2016 findings for passive savings? And the tracking tool doesn't use the Water Research Foundation's reuse study findings. It adjusts the baseline demand forecast that is entered by the user or calculated by the tracking tool based on the plumbing codes for fixtures and appliances in the United States. And in some cases, those individual states have their own codes or standards, and the passive savings models are based on that. That's a really interesting question. Next, we were asked if there's a Canadian version, and they referenced the 2015 Canadian National Plumbing Codes. So as of now, there is not a Canadian version, but that's certainly something we can work toward. So that's a great question and something we could pursue. Our next question asks if there was consideration to use AWWA's water audit results for the tracking tool. And that's a really interesting question as well. Results from the AWWA free water audit software are not directly linked to the tracking tool. However, the results from that could be used to provide insight into strategies to reduce water loss and compare them against water conservation programs. The AWWA water audit results are transferred over to the Water Research Foundation's component analysis model, and that model can be used to design a measure for the tracking tool, and there's guidance in the user guide related to that. So that's a cool question. Now someone's asking, they're saying they're planning to hire a consultant to review their water conservation program impact. Can they provide the consultant with a copy of the tracking tool? And this is similar to a question that was asked earlier, but it's a reverse of that. So the answer is no, unless the consultant is an AWE member. So that's two questions related to that, and both are great questions. So if you're a consultant that's going to do an analysis for a utility, both the consultant and the utility have to be members, and then vice versa. If you're a utility and you're a member but you're hiring a consultant, if they're going to use the tracking tool, they would also have to be a member. And that is spelled out clearly in the terms of use, so you'll see that when you fill that out. And now we have a question about our next webinar, and it says, with the next AWE webinar on school and youth water conservation programs, how would that work with the tracking tool? Well, I think this question is related in regard to education programs and how that would be quantified. So education programs are very difficult to quantify savings for. It can be done potentially, and even if you didn't have a savings estimate, you could integrate the cost of that program into a portfolio of measures that's being evaluated within the tracking tool. And that cost would be added to the portfolio, and as we looked at, you're provided that benefit cost ratio for each program, the suite of programs, and then the suite of programs with overhead included. So looking at the impact of the suite of programs overall, you might see that your group of programs is still cost effective, and that education piece, as we know, is critically important. So that's a really interesting question as well. Next, the question asks, is the Alliance for Water Efficiency looking to provide a similar service to AWWA's WLC Water Audit Data Initiative? And I'm not sure I understand this question 100%, but I think it's related to the AWWA's validated water audit data. And I don't know that at this point we're in a position to have anything like that related to the tracking tool or water conservation, but it's something AWE and its members could potentially pursue if there was interest and willingness from enough utilities, as well as a clear and meaningful way to share those results. So if the person who asked this question or anyone else who listens to this wants to expand on that or discuss with us the possibility of doing something like that, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. Next, we have a question that asks, have you surveyed users to see if they are satisfied with the tracking tool in regard to ease of use and the value of results? And yeah, we've received a lot of feedback on the tracking tool, and that has helped us make changes over the years. So from version 1.0 to now being in 3.0, a lot of the user feedback has helped us shape those changes. So we've heard a lot of positive feedback from users. Next, we are asked, is there a way to bulk order the tool for multiple utilities, or do they have to become members individually? We can process memberships in bulk for multiple utilities, but each utility would be an individual member of AWE, but we can process those all at once. So if you have questions related to that, please email or call the office and we can discuss that. Next, again, another question about our next webinar. Will the next webinar on September 1st be open to anyone? It is free for AWE members and $40 for non-members. Next up, we have a question related to avoided costs, and it reads, how do you deal with different avoided costs? For example, peak season versus non-peak avoided costs. So the user has the option to enter avoided costs manually from their own forecast or use the built-in calculator as we looked at. Each case is going to be unique, and the user would have to determine which costs would be avoided through water conservation and which would be most appropriate to enter. So if you are working on the avoided cost piece of this and you run into some headwinds, don't hesitate to reach out to us and we can talk through it. Next, we're asked, how often will the tracking tool be updated? So we don't have a set schedule for updates, but as things evolve, whether it be plumbing codes or we come up with new measures or we receive a good feedback from users, we'll keep updating the tool. So this is a living, breathing resource that will continue to be updated, but there's not necessarily a set schedule. Next up, we are asked if we plan to have additional webinars on the tracking tool and possibly group sessions so people can interact and ask questions and work through the tracking tool. And this is something that's certainly possible, and if we hear enough interest on this topic, that's something we could do. So if you'd be interested in kind of a tracking tool user group and other sessions, please let us know that you are interested in and any ideas you would have or topics you would want covered for those types of sessions. Next, we're asked for California, if you were to select California as your state, will AWE add features that can be rolled into urban water management plans that are required in California? So the tool doesn't have anything built into it to be exported or rolled into an urban water management plan directly, but a lot of its outputs are certainly applicable to urban water management plans. So it's definitely something that can be used while preparing one of those plans, but we don't have any features that are directly related to it. Next up, this attendee asks, if a utility pays for the replacement of a fixture with a 20-year life, and in 20 years the customer pays for the next fixture, why should the utility claim benefits from the savings of the second fixture that the utility did not pay for? This is a really interesting question, a great question, and it goes back to when we were defining our conservation activities. And I mentioned that for a toilet replacement, you could enter 0 or leave the useful life blank, and that would assume indefinite savings throughout the planning period. So this question is saying, why should the utility claim benefits if in the future that fixture is replaced by the customer who's paying for it 100%? So the tracking tool default from the library of measures assumes the savings from a high efficiency toilet replacement will persist indefinitely. However, the tracking tool offers the flexibility to specify the useful life to whatever the user wishes. So if you have a philosophy that differs from that, you have that flexibility to change it. In addition, when the tracking tool is assuming that indefinite savings for the high efficiency toilet, it's because there's a plumbing code and that fixture is going to be replaced with something equally or greater in terms of efficiency. So over time, the savings are being discounted because of the plumbing code. And we looked at that chart, uh, you know, for reference if you want to rewind to that specific slide where we're looking at the high efficiency toilet savings. It shows that over time, savings are being credited to the plumbing code instead of the utility. So it accounts for that in that regard. But check it out, work through that worksheet. And like I always encourage users, you know, if you have like this question, for example, try it with no useful life and then try it with a 20-year useful life and see how those savings are different. And you could even adjust the plumbing code as well. So that was a really cool question. Next, an attendee asked, is the number of conservation activities that can be inputted into the tracking tool still limited to 50? And yes, the maximum number of activities you can enter in one scenario is limited to 50. However, you could create multiple scenarios and go beyond that. Next, a user wants to know, is the tracking tool set up for a single user? As a water provider, would I be able to add multiple customers or cities to help develop plans by customer? You can add multiple scenarios in the scenario manager, and if other cities or utilities or AWE members, you could collaborate and share the file. So I'm not sure I answered that question exactly as it was maybe intended. So if whoever asked that question, if I wasn't clear in my answer, please feel free to call or email and we'll get that answered. Next, this attendee asked, can you explain why irrigation controller replacement programs are not cost effective? And as I mentioned when we were looking at the benefits and costs, the examples used in this presentation are completely fictitious, and it shouldn't be taken as a certain measure being cost effective or not being cost effective. The cost effectiveness will differ for every utility. Every utility has their own set of costs that can be avoided. Each utility will plan its programs different in terms of how much they're going to spend on an incentive, and even the savings will differ for each utility, and especially with outdoor programs, those savings ranges can be wide. So that's a good question, and hopefully I made that more clear in this presentation versus during the webinar. We have another question then related to useful life, and it says, regarding the define activities worksheet, would you recommend 0 for the useful life of all devices? If no, and I put 20 years in for an HET program, do those savings transfer from active to passive savings in the year 21? So that's an interesting question. I would first part of that question is I would say no, you should not enter 0 for the useful life of all fixtures. It may pertain to some and not others. If you enter 20 years for an HET, the savings will stop after that 20-year period. And again, I would say experiment and change those variables within the define activities worksheet. And not only is it good just to answer this specific question and see how that functions, but a great way to get familiar with a model is to make changes. And one of the coolest things about the tracking tool is that it makes those changes on the fly. So if you change a useful life and then switch over and look at the savings from that activity, the impact and calculation is immediate. So again, another great question. Next up, we have a question about water loss, and it says, in regard to water loss audit programs, are you planning to introduce pressure management at the utility scale? This is a great question, and we don't have that as a default in the library, but the user guide does contain guidance on using the Water Research Foundation component analysis model to build a water loss control program. The component analysis model does include pressure management options, so you may be able to build that in as an activity from scratch. Next up, we're asked, what is the source for the eGrid data related to CO2 emissions? The source for that is the EPA. They have a database available on the internet. As I mentioned during the presentation, we updated it to the most recent one that was released in 2015, and there's a link to it within the tracking tool. Next up, we're asked if the International Plumbing Code is included as one of the baseline codes. This is an interesting question, and I would say not really, and that's because the baseline demand forecast is entered by the user, or the user uses the built-in calculator to come up with the demand forecast. That forecast is then adjusted based on federal or state standards, such as the Energy Policy Act, if we're talking the federal level. For example, the number of inefficient toilets in the service area is estimated from the demographic data, and then those natural replacement rates and estimated savings are based on federal or state plumbing standards. Next, we're asked if the PowerPoint will be available after the presentation. Yes, it will be, and now this recording is available. We were sad that we lost the audio on the original recording, but here we are again recording it. So this is available, and we'll also post a PDF of the actual slides. Next up, is there a tracking component to this tool, actual versus planned conservation? And yeah, we touched on that a bit earlier. Another user asked a similar question, and you can track previous conservation activity. You could start a different scenario for that, or have another file altogether if you wanted to do tracking versus planned. Do you know if there are states that are working on legislation to do water conservation across their state? Yes, I'm sure there are. There's been a lot of activity at the state level to promote water conservation and efficiency. We have a report on our website where we scored each state based on their policies related to water conservation and efficiency. And we also have state pages on our website with information on each state's policies. The bulk of that work was done in 2012, but we try to update states as new legislation is passed. So our last question now is, where do we go to download the tracking tool? So I'm going to go out to our website, and I'll take you on a quick tour to show you where you download the tracking tool, and then I'll show you our state pages as well, so you can see where we have that state information. So here we're on the Alliance for Water Efficiency homepage, and hover over the resource library, we'll see the tracking tool link. So Alliance Water Conservation Tracking Tool. And if we click there, we're taken to this page all about the tracking tool. And real quick, we were asked about the list of conservation measures, and you could click on this link and obtain that. There's also the differences between version 2 and 3, and a list of data inputs for version 3. And then we'll add this presentation below. If we want to get the tracking tool, we go to how to get the tracking tool, and current members click here, to read and accept the terms of use. So read through the terms of use, and then you fill out this form, your contact name, organization, city, state, zip, country, phone, and email, and click the I accept button. And when you click that button, this form will be sent to AWE staff, and we will email you a link to download the tracking tool and the user guide, provided you're a member. So since we got asked about our state information there at the end, I'll show you that as well. So if you hover over Resource Library and then go to State Info, you can follow that link. And here's all the information about states. So you can download our report, the Water Efficiency and Conservation State Scorecard, and then each state you can click through and see the different policies that states have. So we're looking to update this in the very near future. So if this is a topic that interests you, check back, and we'll hopefully have a new report out in the future. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you for all the attendees and all the great questions that were asked. It was a really good question session. So thanks a lot, and if you have any questions about the tracking tool, let us know and we'll get you squared away.